Well, good morning. It's good to be with you again on this Sunday morning. Before we go to our lesson, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Oh, merciful Redeemer, help us to stand for righteousness and to refuse to compromise. Help us to have an unwavering faith. Help us to value everyone equally. May we know you more clearly. May we love you more dearly. May we follow you more dearly, day by day. Amen. All right, so just in case you haven't noticed the pattern of my opening prayers, they talk about the theme of the lesson of the day. And so the lesson for today is about unwavering faith. Unwavering faith. Now, first of all, what's the word faith mean? Let's give a little definition here. Who'd like to offer?
Believing in something you hadn't seen.
Okay, that's certainly, interestingly enough, in the English language, the word faith has multiple meanings. You know, we've talked about this before, that one of the potential difficulties of English language is that we use one word and give it multiple meanings, and then we've got to figure out which one of those meanings fits the sentence that it's in. So that's certainly true. What else is true about the word faith? The word faith. Well, the possibilities are a belief in trust and a loyalty to God. Okay, that's an attribute of faith. A belief in doctrines of a religion, to say that I've got faith. It's a firm belief in something which there is no proof, which is the one that you gave. It's a complete trust, to say I have faith in, and we're in the context of that sentence, we're saying I have complete trust in something, and something that is believed with a strong conviction. So faith is more than just a passing, oh yeah, that's sort of okay, I'll accept that. No, that's not faith. Faith is a strong conviction. So the lesson writer started out with the example of John the Baptist, to show somebody who had this strong conviction, loyalty to God, faith in his life. He was not afraid to go against the culture of his day. Is our culture any better? Any different?
No.
What was the culture of the day? What were some of the attributes that you can think of that might cause somebody like John the Baptist to come along? Well, some of those attributes were, and as I mentioned in my prayer, this idea of treating everyone equally. See, in their day, they didn't live under a democracy. They lived under a monarchy. There was the king, or the Romans called it the emperor, and the emperor had absolute authority. And the emperor could do or say anything the emperor wanted to do, and everybody else was supposed to toe the line automatically. They also had a society where about 2% of the population lived comfortably. They were called Roman citizens. Everybody else was in virtual subsistence living. In other words, they worried from day to day about what they would have to eat or what they might be able to do. And so because of that, there was a lot of animosity within their culture. And so there was a lot of conflict, a lot of bad feelings, a lot of hate, a lot of things that we talked about in our last set of lessons about the priority of love. And that's why when Jesus came along and started talking about love, 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 even your enemies, even the people you despise, that was shocking, because that's not the culture that they lived in, that they were trying to survive in. So John the Baptist stood for righteousness. Now, there's another good word. Now, what does righteousness mean? What's the definition? It gets used a lot of different ways, but in this context, what does it mean, do you think?
Living holy before God?
Yes, or living in the will of God. In other words, doing what God said to do. Okay? So he was doing what God had led him to do. He was telling the people the truth of God, which was not exactly the way their culture, even their religious culture of that day was operating one way or the other. So he stood for righteousness even in the face of political leaders. And in his day, they were largely wicked and hostile. So political leaders sometimes, and we can see this all throughout human history, from time to time there are political leaders that decide that, well, you know, that they don't have to listen to anybody, they can do whatever they want to do, and they do things that are not good for the population. So John preached. Now, he did not preach in the temple grounds. He didn't preach in the synagogues. He preached in the wilderness. Why? Why? Well, the lesson writer said that part of that may have been the fact that because of what he was preaching, he was not particularly welcome in those religious places. And so he chose to say, okay, I'm going to go off. Now, who did some people say John was? You know, when John was out there preaching and people tried to figure out, well, who is this guy? Elijah. Yeah, which preceded Elijah. But Elijah. And so what were some of the characteristics about Elijah? He was also somebody that went off into the wilderness. He was also somebody who didn't line up with the authorized religion of the day. So if you think back to the story about Elijah, the king had been convinced by his wife Jezebel that rather than worshiping Yahweh, they should be worshiping Balaam. And they should have these pagan worships. And so that became the official worship of the time. And Elijah coming and reminding people about God was not exactly welcome in that. So he was also somebody that went off into the wilderness. So let's look first of all at what it was about John's preaching. Because it must have been very, very convincing even to the political leadership, even to the king. So let's go to Mark, the 6th chapter. Mark 6. And I'm going to start reading with the 17th verse. For Herod, now this isn't the Herod of the birth of Jesus, this is his son, because that Herod had already died. For Herod himself had sent and laid hold of John, and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother's Philip's wife, for he had married her, because John had said to Herod, it is not lawful to you to have your brother's wife. Therefore Herodias held it against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not. Why? 20th verse. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just and holy man, and he protected him. He protected him. So so John's message rang so true that even Herod, when John said, Herod, you've done wrong. You need to repent. Well, kings in those days, you know, they weren't about repenting. They were about telling people what to do. But it rang so true that Herod recognized that, well, this is a just and righteous man. And he protected him. And he heard him. And he did many things, and he heard him what? Gladly. Gladly. Okay, so that's to Herod's credit. Well, something went wrong. Right? Because what happened to John not long after this?
Beheaded.
Yeah, he was beheaded. Why? Not because Herod, but Herod was foolish enough to make one of these open-ended blank check promises to a young dancing girl that pleased him. And he said, well, I'll do anything you want me to do. Just tell me what it is. And this was in front of the whole court.
That's what you could say, the devil made me do it. Or
Yeah.
made me do it.
Right.
Which it probably was.
Probably was. That's exactly right. And so she says, because she was had been influenced by Herodias, the wife, he said, well, I want John's head. And so Herod, thinking, well, I'm in front of my whole court, I've made this promise, I can't go against my promise, against his better judgment, against what he knew was right, he had John beheaded anyway. Okay, so it was because. Now, if we go back to the Elijah story, is there a parallel in the Elijah story? Yeah, there was a wife called Jezebel that pursued Elijah after he was up on the mountain, you know, and he defeated all of the priests of Balaam. And then she was coming after him to kill him, and he goes back off into the wilderness. So there's some definite parallels between the life and ministry of Elijah and the life and ministry of John the Baptist. So notice, John preached or talked the same way in the wilderness and in the palace. Okay? He didn't modify his truth just because he was in a place of power and authority and they didn't necessarily like what he was going to say, but he said the same thing there that he said out in the wilderness to the people that come. So the parallelism with Elijah wasn't lost on a lot of people, and that's recorded as well, as people were asking whether or not John was in fact Elijah coming back. So the pressure of secular society is always with us. Okay? It always has been, it is now, and it will continue to be. The pressure of society to fit in, to not rock the boat, to just go along. You know, those kinds of attributes of compromise. So, wicked kings and queens is which all they had, or just we might just say leaders. Wicked leaders are scattered all throughout history, and it's something that we should be aware of. Because, so therefore, the truth that we seek is the truth that is given to us by God. And if that truth conflicts with the truth of a leader, then which one are we going to listen to? And John kept telling the people, you need to listen to God. So, there were examples of how the culture got into the early church, how easily we as human beings can kind of forget. We can forget this because John the Baptist became kind of history by the time the early church came into being. And within 10 years after the resurrection, the early church was struggling with all sorts of things because of the influence of the Roman Greek culture. Because remember, many of the early Christians were Gentiles. So they came out of the pagan worship experiences of the Greeks and the Romans. And they brought some of that with them. And they said, well, this seems good to us, so let's do that. And it caused some real problems in the early church. And in fact, if we go back to to Revelation. Let's go to Revelation first. John, this is the Apostle John, records for us some things that were said relative to how the churches have been going in the first century. So this is in the 2nd chapter of Revelation. I'm going to start reading with verse number 6. And it said, but this you have, that you hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. So he that has to hear, let him hear. Well, who is it that he's speaking to in this? Well, this is the church at Ephesus. So he's talking about, in each of these, he's talking about, well, there's some things you're doing right and some things you're doing wrong and that you need to correct. Well, one of them is at the church of Ephesus. He says, well, one of the things you're doing right is you hate this doctrine of the Nicolaitans. Who are these folks? Well, before we answer that question, let's go down to the 14th verse, where he's now talking to the church at Pergamum. Get tongue-tied over that Greek name. So we go down to the 14th, and so to that church he says, I have a few things against you, because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, and taught Balak to the stumbling block before the children of Israel to eat things sacrificed to idols and to commit sexual immorality. You have also those who hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which thing I hate. Oh, well, we need to know a little bit about the Nicolaitans. Who was the founder of this particular movement? So if we go back to Acts, the 6th chapter. Acts, the 6th chapter. And verses 5 and 6. And the saying pleased the whole multitude, and they chose Stephen, a man full of faith in the Holy Spirit, and Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenius, and Nicholas, a proselyte from Antioch. Okay, so Nicholas is the person who started what became known as the doctrine of the Nicolaitans. In other words, the Nicholas followers. A similar word pattern as Christian, so Nicholas. He was a proselyte. Well, what does that mean? He had been converted to Judaism, which means he had been a follower of the pagan religions of the Eastern Mediterranean before that. So he had been a pagan worshiper, he became a Jew, and then he became Christian and became one of the followers, and he's pointed out here as one of those that was selected. That's all we know about him in the New Testament. So we have to go to the writings of the early church, in particular the writings of Irenaeus, which he wrote early in the 2nd century about the history of what had happened in the 1st century. And he talks about Nicholas and the following that he had. And so here's what we know. It was a form of Gnosticism. And this was a big deal in the 1st century church. Gnosticism. What was Gnosticism? Well, it was taking a Greek cultural concept that the things that are physical are bad and the things that are spiritual are good. And so as long as your spiritual is right, it didn't make any difference what happened in the physical. And so they took that to the extreme to mean literally they could do anything in the physical and it didn't matter. It was okay. And so this doctrine of the Nicolaitans came to include things that that salvation is a secret knowledge, and so you really can't understand it. God could not have created evil, so therefore there must be an evil God, a parallel God in the universe. And since material is corrupt, Jesus could not have been human. Okay? Which was the principal thing about Gnosticism that really upset the apostles. Saying that, well, Jesus wasn't really human, so he didn't really experience anything that we experience. Because he was fully God, he was just God, and God is above everything that we experience. So, as we look at this particular lesson, what we want to keep in mind is the early church was influenced by culture. Some of the leaders of the early church became influenced by the Greek and Roman culture. Tried to merge parts of it into it, to say, well, why don't we just take a bit of this, which seems good, and we'll combine it with this, and that'll be what we believe and what we practice. And that's been true. If you look at Christian history for the last 2,000 years, we've gone through all sorts of cycles of that sort of thing being true. It might be interesting just to do a church history study sometime to show how the church has ebbed and flowed in terms of how it's dealt with the culture. So the lesson for us is, do we take the time? Remember we talked back at Christmas time that one of the attributes of Mary that's recorded in more than one location is that when she was told something by the angel, she pondered it. Okay? She didn't just accept it. She thought deeply about it. What does this mean? What should I do? So this lesson writer is challenging us to do the same thing about the culture that we live in. Have we pondered what are the attributes of our culture that we really shouldn't be supporting because they're not in line with what Jesus told us, how to live? What does it mean to follow Him? And to not follow that. And what are the things that are aligned with what Jesus told us and that we need to not only support but encourage in our culture? We've talked about this before. The statistics of our culture relative to religion, Christianity in particular, are not encouraging trend lines. There's an upward trend, a growing and growing percentage of the people who live in our country who not only don't practice or adhere to religion, there's a growing percentage that say, well, there is no God at all. So therefore, whatever seems good, whatever feels good, is good. And you can see those attributes around us in our culture as you look around for them. So ponder. What does it mean? What are the aspects of our culture that are not consistent with Jesus, that we should not participate in? And what are those things that we should not only participate in, but encourage in others? To say, yes, this is the way to live, the way Jesus told us to live. Okay, that's our lesson for today. We'll pick up on more aspects of faith next week.